Marie-Henri Beyle, who is better known as Stendhal, was a womanizer, a realist in his writing, and he described himself as an egotist, having written a short book called Memoirs of an Egotist about his life in Paris and London. He was born in Dauphine in southeastern France. It's a former province. It doesn't exist anymore. That was under the Kingdom of France in 1783. And he died in 1842 at the age of 59 in Paris. His reward for his womanizing was that he got syphilis when he was 25. And toward the end of his life, he suffered heavily from the side effects of the medication for it. And it's a little ambiguous, but either the syphilis or the side effects are what killed him. In 1810, when he was about 27, he became an auditor with the French State Council. And though as an auditor, it seems that he was in what we would today call logistics, it doesn't seem like he ever saw combat. He participated in the Napoleonic Wars in Italy. He traveled extensively in Germany, and he also was in Napoleon's army when he invaded Russia in 1812. And he apparently saw Moscow burn from outside the city. As the French army retreated, he was able to find a spot in the Berezina River where him and his friends could cross the river without using the pontoon bridge that was overwhelmed. And in doing so, he might have saved him and his friends' lives because, of course, the retreat from Moscow, from Russia, was such a catastrophe for the French army. During that campaign, he became known for keeping calm under pressure, for keeping his wits about him. And even on the retreat, he kept up his daily routine, shaving every day. Stendhal used hundreds of pen names and false names and gave them to his friends. He would use made-up names for his friends. He used funny names too, like Don Flem and William Crocodile. Stendhal's friend Prosper Mérimée, who was himself a writer, he was the writer of the novella Carmen, which is now famous because of the opera by Bizet. By the way, even if you don't listen to opera or to classical music generally, you definitely know certain melodies from Carmen. But Mérimée said of Stendhal, quote, "He never wrote a letter without signing a false name," end quote. So Stendhal, whenever he wrote a letter, or very often when he wrote a letter, he would just make up a name with which to sign it. So if you were living in Paris in the 1820s and you got a letter from William Crocodile, you went, oh, that must be Marie-Henri. The origin of the name Stendhal comes from the German city by the same name, though that city is spelled without an H, Stendal, and Stendhal spells it Stendhal. He stayed in the city in 1807 when he was about 24, and while he was there, he fell in love with a German woman named Wilhelmine. She is why he stayed in the city for a while. So this pen name became the most significant, I think in part in memory of this German woman whom he loved. Stendhal was a big fan of music. He really liked Mozart and Rossini, and also a composer of whom I hadn't heard named Domenico Cimarosa, who I now have to go check out. Rossini even gets a passing reference in the novel that we're going to be looking at today, The Red and the Black. Nietzsche called Stendhal France's last great psychologist. And of course, he was using the word psychology differently from how we use it today. He was using it to mean studying the human mind almost the way that an artist studies a landscape. That is, subjectively trying to observe it correctly and to reproduce it. Listeners of this podcast know from an earlier episode that Nietzsche said something similar about Guy de Maupassant, who similarly wrote stories in which he sought to realistically depict the psychology of the characters in his stories. As we'll see, Stendhal is stylistically very different from Maupassant, but Nietzsche liked both of them and considered them both psychologists, and they do have some similarities. The Red and the Black was published in 1830. It takes place during the period called the Second Restoration, which is roughly from 1815 to about 1830. So it's in the aftermath of the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars and then the Bourbon Restoration in 1814 and then 1815. So the French monarchy is back in. Then, even in the year of the publication of the book in 1830, there's another revolution called the July Revolution. But that was a revolution of one king to another rather than a king to a republic or an emperor to a king, as the previous ones had been. All the same, these politics are fairly central in the story. At least they're looming in the background. The rich people in the story are often worried about being slaughtered by poor people in a second revolution. And remember, the Reign of Terror was roughly 1793 and 1794, so at most, maybe 30 or 35 years before this. So to put it in perspective, you could imagine that the year is 2023, and in 1990, something like the Reign of Terror had happened. What would the political climate be like in that context? That's where we are in The Red and the Black. I found this book to be very interesting. It's not necessarily for everyone because it's a little bit slow moving, and there's a lot of descriptions of romantic tension, and Stendhal does that very well. We'll get into that. But if you do read it, it is a rich novel with a lot to get out of it, a lot to think about, a lot to discuss. I was telling my wife about this book, and she said that it sounded a bit like Jane Austen. Anyway, I have it on my list to read some Jane Austen. Not literally, my reading list for this year, for 2023, doesn't have any Jane Austen on it, but figuratively in my mind, someday I want to read some Jane Austen. And that's in part because for a long time, I had this idea, I think a lot of people have this idea, that Jane Austen is for girls. It's got cooties or something. I guess because she wrote a lot about women's inner thoughts in their interactions with men. And I don't want to speak too soon. I might someday read Jane Austen and then thereafter confirm that, yes, Jane Austen has cooties. Because one of the things that's interesting about Stendhal is that these romances that he describes, he's able to describe them both from the man's perspective and from the woman's perspective. And the protagonist, Julian, is a little bit of a narcissist. He's a little bit of a bungler with women sometimes. But Stendhal clearly was writing from experience when he wrote about the male perspective of this kind of situation. Julian is a guy in his early 20s. He doesn't have much experience with women, and he finds himself in these romances. And I'm using the word romance because I can't think of a better word for it. I'm thinking of a situation, on the one hand, I was going to say a romantic chess match, because it's an ongoing thing and the two sides have these different moves and they think about the situation and they react to it. But in at least one of the cases, the woman is not thinking of it that way at all. She's really just head over heels for him. So it would be inaccurate to call that a chess match, though Julian maybe is thinking about it a little bit more deliberately than she is, though that's debatable. But in the other romance in the story, the woman is more experienced with men, and she is able to better keep Julian on his toes. And though a lot of the action of the story, not all of it, but a lot of the action of the story does revolve around these romances, I definitely would not say that the book is about romance, or that it's a love story or something. The book is about class, history, religion, and hypocrisy definitely plays a big role as well. I want to say that this would be a good book for people in their early 20s or their 20s in general to read, because it shows the kinds of dumb things that both men and women do in their 20s. And also the fact that Stendhal is writing this close to 200 years ago shows that that hasn't changed much. And I think that if somebody who was 20 to 25 years old reading this book, one of two things would happen. Either they would recognize, oh, this character is doing that and it looks kind of dumb when he does it, so I better not do that. And I sometimes do that kind of thing. Alternatively, they might miss that message entirely, and the story might just resonate with them because they would say, oh, I can really identify with this character. They do things just like I do. And Julian is a very interesting character because on the one hand, he is kind of a psycho. His primary concern is reaching some high office, and he doesn't even really care what it is. It might be military, it might be priestly, and it changes. He just wants to go up. So if you hear me reading a passage and going, oh, isn't that interesting? Isn't that cool that he says that or whatever? Do not take that at all to mean that we should embrace Julian as a role model. Because part of what makes the novel effective is that we see the innermost thoughts of these characters. And while some of those thoughts are pretty reprehensible, there are aspects of them, or at the very least moments, that we can identify with, at least when we're at our worst. And the two women in the story, whose names are Madame de Renal and Mathilde de la Mole, and I'll call the second one Mathilde because otherwise the names are too similar. I imagine that women reading this story could read some lines describing these two women in which they at least get a flash of something that they recognize in themselves. Some vanity, some desire for attention or excitement or novelty. In Julian, I think that something that most guys will recognize from their initial encounters with women is his clumsiness. For example, first, Madame de Renal is really into him, and he's unaware, apparently. And so he's just naturally acting indifferent to her. And meanwhile, she's going crazy thinking about him. But then when he finally picks up on it, he says, oh, I have to act like a tough guy or something. And then he just becomes boorish and annoying, and then she's not interested anymore. So he was captivating to her as long as he wasn't aware that she was interested in him. And he's very fickle. He's very affected by whatever is in front of him. Now he wants to be a soldier. Now he wants to be a priest, as I mentioned. And it depends on what impressive thing he sees. And I think different young people and different people of any age can be more and less focused on a single goal, more and less easily distracted. I think that if you have something in your childhood or your adolescence where you were working on one thing a lot, whether it was an instrument or a sports team or something, that might make you a little bit better in your 20s at not getting pulled this way and that way and dropping a project and starting the next thing. But I think young people especially are susceptible to the impact of some impressive thing that they see with their eyes, if for no other reason than they hadn't encountered it before. Maybe they hadn't seen it or thought about it, or they didn't even know that there was such a profession, or they knew that it existed, but they'd never seen it presented in such an impressive way, or they hadn't seen members of the opposite sex fawning over somebody who's in that profession. Young men, if they don't have their feet firmly planted on the ground, if they're not committed to some goal or project, that if they see women fawning over something, they can be very easily affected by that. And maybe that's why it's important to have something beyond as your indicator of quality, because the crowd changes, fashion changes, the people who are around you change. So if you're born in a village in 19th century France, and all you know is that you want to go up, and you don't care how, and maybe you've never really thought carefully about what up means, then you are extremely vulnerable to being blown off course by the crosswinds of the crowd. And that might be true in a similar way in 2023. If you're born poor and you have access to social media and all you know is that you want to go up, you want to get more money, more status, and you don't care how, then it's likely that you're going to make a fool of yourself and waste a lot of time. But the book touches on these various dimensions, rich and poor, and also the tension between the simple life and the adventurous life. But that's enough initial discussion. Now we can get into some passages. And I'm going to try to talk about this book without giving anything major away. And my guess is that different people are listening to this for different reasons. Some of you have read the book and are reflecting on it and are interested to hear what somebody else thought about it. Others maybe are considering reading it but want to get an idea of it first. And others feel that they maybe don't have the time to read it, probably because they spend too much time on social media. Or maybe they don't know how to grab onto an old book like this, how to approach it. Maybe they don't yet feel that they're most comfortable when they're reading an old book. And to those people, I would say that I hope that you can take this episode and this podcast in general as a kind of how to read an old book. Anybody who wants to can do it. You don't need any special training. It definitely gets more fun the more that you know, because you can connect this to that and compare that to the other thing. And there's definitely books that are better and worse to start with. But other than that, you really just read it, take some notes of what interests you, react to whatever you react to, and then think about it afterwards. But anyway, you might get some clues from listening to this that if you're certain you're going to read this book and you don't want to have any clues, then maybe stop the podcast and go read it and then come back. But this book isn't really based on surprises. So if you listen to this and still want to read it, you absolutely can. So finally, let's get to this first passage. In the beginning of the story, Julien is in a village. He's the son of a carpenter. He's sort of handsome but frail. He has two older brothers who are a lot tougher than him. They help their dad with his carpentry. He's kind of bookish, and he somehow lands a job as the tutor of the children of the mayor of the town. And while he's there, both the wife of the mayor and one of the maids fall in love with him. And the maid tells the local priest, who is a mentor to Julien, that she wants to marry him. And the priest is very happy about this. He thinks it's a great match. But Julien tells the priest, Abbé Chélan, that he doesn't want to marry the maid, Elisa. And the priest tells Julien, quote, "If you think of paying court to the men in power, your eternal ruin is assured. You may make your fortune, but you will have to injure the poor and needy, flatter the sub-prefect, the mayor, the important person, and minister to his passions. Such conduct, which in the world is called the art of life, may, in a layman, be not wholly incompatible with salvation. But in our calling, we have to choose. We must make our fortune either in this world or in the next. There is no middle way." End quote. Julien had, by that point, expressed his interest in becoming a priest, and he also somehow speaks very good Latin. He's memorized the entire New Testament in Latin. So that's why this priest is advising him. And here's a short, interesting description of Madame de Renal, who's the wife of the mayor, who loves Julien, and they have a bit of an affair, though it's a little ambiguous in both the case of Madame de Renal and Matilda, whether the relationship is ever sexual. It might just be glances and holding hands and slipping notes to each other. I saw one passage in the case of Matilda where he says something like, her hair looked messy and that reminded him of a nice memory. And that's the most explicit thing I could see, though maybe I missed something. Somebody can point it out to me if they saw something that really explicitly showed that their relationships were sexual. In the case of Madame de Renal, I really can't remember anything. Anyway, Stendhal writes of Madame de Renal, quote, "Entirely absorbed, before Julien came, in that mass of work which outside Paris is the lot of a good wife and mother, Madame de Renal thought about the passions as we think about the lottery, a certain disappointment and a happiness sought by fools alone." End quote. So before Julien comes along, Madame de Renal has a pretty stable life. She's a wife and a mother. She doesn't really trust the passions. The worst thing about her life is that her husband is kind of boorish. He's not abusive, but he's just kind of a jerk. And she thought of the passions as we think about the lottery, a certain disappointment and happiness sought by fools alone. And there's another line that I think reflects a lot of 20-year-olds. This is about Julien. Quote, "On returning to his room, he thought of one happiness only, that of going on with his favorite book. At 20, the thought of the world and of the impression one is going to make on it prevails over everything else." End quote. I think that's something that a lot of 20-year-olds think about, though they should, and a lot of 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds should too. But when you're 20, you don't yet have much of an idea of what the world actually is, so there's something kind of funny about that. Here's another passage that shows Julien's boyish arrogance. Quote, "Only a fool," he told himself, "loses his temper with other people. A stone falls because it is heavy. Am I always to remain a boy? When am I going to form the good habit of giving these people their exact money's worth and no more of my heart and soul? If I wish to be esteemed by them and by myself, I must show them that it is my poverty that deals with their wealth, but that my heart is 1,000 leagues away from their insolence and is placed in too exalted a sphere to be reached by their petty marks of contempt or favor." End quote. And this is interesting on a couple levels. The first is that that's not a bad goal, to be indifferent to people's contempt or favor. That's kind of a philosopher's goal, to follow some inner principle that you've deemed to be good and true after trying to evaluate everything. But there's a couple things here that show Julien's immaturity. One is this really high-flown language, that his heart is placed in too exalted a sphere to be reached by them. He's not just indifferent to them, he's in too exalted a sphere. But more importantly, while saying this, Julien is orienting his whole life around the contempt and favor of other people. And most of all, in that one sentence, he contradicts himself. He says, if I wish to be esteemed by them and by myself, then I should show that I'm indifferent to their contempt or favor. Which do you want? Are you trying to be esteemed by them, or are you trying to be indifferent to their contempt? And this is something that runs throughout the whole book. When he's at the seminary, when he's in Paris, the women's perception of him, the women's perception of the other men, this relationship between the individual and the crowd, and whether people are following the crowd or pursuing their own true north, this runs throughout the story. And another example of this youthful narcissism is, quote, "The young peasant saw no obstacle between himself and the most heroic actions, save want of opportunity," end quote. If only he had the chance, he would do heroic things too. The meaning of the title of the book, The Red and the Black, is a bit unclear. There is a French card game called The Red and Black, but the red and black can also be a reference to the secular, the red, and the clerical, or the religious, the black. During the storming of the Bastille in 1789, the revolutionaries had blue and red ribbons on their hats. The red has also referred to the bourgeoisie, which historically referred to a class distinct from the aristocracy, but also from the peasantry. So it's roughly the middle class, but sometimes it's used to mean rich people. Whatever exactly the red is, I think it's reasonable to take the black to mean the clerical class and the red as something in opposition to it, especially because that tension is present throughout the book between religion and upper class life and other things. And that's shown in passages like this one. The king has come to visit the village where Julian lives. Quote, after the bishop's address and the king's reply, his majesty took his place beneath the dais. He then knelt down most devoutly upon a cushion close to the altar. The choir was enclosed with stalls, and these stalls were raised 2 steps above the pavement. It was on the second of these steps that Julian sat at the feet of Monsieur Chalon, not unlike a train-bearer at the feet of his cardinal in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. There were a Te Deum, clouds of incense, endless volleys of musketry and artillery. The peasants were frantic with joy and piety. Such a day undoes the work of 100 numbers of the Jacobin papers. End quote. So in this period of political unrest, where there is revolutions and wars and counter-revolutions, there are still competing factions, roughly Royalists and Jacobins, and the two sides use various means to try to sway the public. The Jacobins have their newspapers, and in this case, the traditional forces in society have religion, and in this case, they're also using military displays with the religious ones, and this display undoes the work of 100 numbers of the Jacobin papers. It does a lot to excite the public and draw their loyalty. This next passage was funny. It shows something I mentioned earlier, how young people, especially young men, can be very impressed by something that they see young women interested in, and they can want to emulate it. Quote, outside the door were gathered on their knees 24 girls, belonging to the most distinguished families of Verrières. Verrières is the village in which the first part of the story takes place. Before opening the door, the bishop sank on his knees in the midst of these girls, who were all pretty. While he was praying aloud, it seemed as though they could not sufficiently admire his fine lace, his charm, his young and pleasant face. This spectacle made our hero lose all that remained of his reason. At that moment, he would have fought for the Inquisition, and in earnest. End quote. So he'd be ready to join the Inquisition just to be the one all these young and pretty girls are admiring. He later has an opportunity to attend a fancy dinner, and the place where they're eating is positioned next to a prison for some reason. And while they're eating, one of the prisoners can be heard singing a song, and the host of the dinner gives a subtle signal to one of his men, and the man goes out of the room and the singing stops. And Julian is very distressed by this, that they're sitting there eating this nice meal, and meanwhile, in the next room, prisoners are not even allowed to sing, much less to eat, and maybe they're hungry in there, and he's thinking about all this. Quote, there, Julian's conscience warned him, you have the sordid fortune which you will achieve, and you will enjoy it only in these conditions and in such company as this. You will have a place worth perhaps 20,000 francs, but it must be that while you gorge to repletion, you stop the poor prisoner from singing. You will give dinner parties with the money you have filched from his miserable pittance, and during your dinner he will be more wretched still. O Napoleon, how pleasant it was in your time to climb to fortune through the dangers of a battle, but meanly to intensify the sufferings of the wretched. End quote. He's imagining his future when he's achieved something and thinking about the cost of even what he might achieve if he's that lucky. And throughout the book, Julian is praising Napoleon, but also both he and Matilda are always thinking about how great things were in the past. He's thinking of Napoleon, she's thinking of her Crusader ancestors. Julian has a friend named Fouquet who offers him a job in his lumber company. He needs somebody to help him organize his books and do his deals, somebody he trusts, and he offers Julian a job that would pay well. And Julian doesn't consider it long, but he declines. And this is interesting because this and the marriage that he also declines with Elisa, these are the opportunities for a simple, stable life that he gets early on, and he rejects them because in his mind they wouldn't be grandiose enough, they wouldn't be adventurous enough. And in a passage considering that, he says, quote, could happiness be thus within my reach? The cost of such a life is nothing. I can, as I choose, marry Miss Elisa or become Fouquet's partner. But the traveler who has just climbed a steep mountain sits down on the summit and finds a perfect pleasure in resting. Would he be happy if he were forced to rest always? End quote. And this is a tension between a life that is striving, taking risks, aiming high, and a life that is stable, secure, simple, humble, peaceful. And I don't think that real life is only between these two choices. I think you can have a stable life where you're still striving towards something. Julian is striving towards something and he doesn't even know what it is or why he's striving toward it. Julian eventually makes his way to Paris and he stumbles into a cafe. Quote, "The young lady behind the counter had remarked the charming appearance of this young country cousin, who, brought to a standstill 3 paces from the stove, hugging his little bundle under his arm, was studying the bust of the king in gleaming white plaster. This young lady, a strapping Franc-Comtois, extremely well made and dressed in the style calculated to give tone to a cafe, had already said twice, in a low voice so modulated that only Julian could hear her, 'Sir, sir.' Julian's gaze met that of a pair of the most tender blue eyes, and saw that it was himself who was being addressed. He stepped briskly up to the counter and the pretty girl as he might have advanced in the face of the enemy. As he executed this great movement, his bundle fell to the ground." End quote. So if you've ever done something like that, don't worry. 200 years ago in Paris, guys were trying to look cool in front of women and dropping their stuff on the ground. And by the way, he's in that cafe, but a guy comes up and drinks brandy in it. So it's kind of a mixture of what we would today call a bar and a cafe. They serve coffee, but they also serve alcohol and other things. Later, he enters the seminary and he has a kind of brief entrance interview. And he's speaking to a priest who asks him a bunch of questions. Quote, "In fact," thought the Abbé Pirard, "here is another instance of that fatal tendency towards Protestantism, which I have always had to rebuke in Chélan. A too thorough acquaintance with the Holy Scriptures." Julian had just spoken to him, without having been questioned on the subject, of the true date of authorship of Genesis, the Pentateuch, etc. "To what does all this endless discussion of the Holy Scriptures lead," thought the Abbé Pirard, "if not to private judgment, that is to say, to the most fearful Protestantism." End quote. So this priest is worried that too much individual knowledge of the Scriptures leads to private judgment and to Protestantism. And they're, of course, Catholic. And later they have a short interchange about honor. Quote, "The Abbé Pirard advised Julian not to join any secret society or congregation without his consent. 'I give you my word of honor,' said Julian with the heartfelt warmth of an honest man." The director of the seminary smiled for the first time. "That expression is not in keeping here," he told him. "It is too suggestive of the vain honor of men of the world, which leads them into so many errors and often into crime." End quote. I don't know what they teach in seminary these days, but it was interesting to see this glimpse into what they might have been teaching in the seminary in the 19th century, because it wasn't only theology, it was also character. And that's just an example. I don't agree with that view of honor, but it's interesting that they were even teaching that kind of thing to the students of the seminary. And it takes them a while to figure out something else at the seminary. Quote, "Julian never read anything in their lackluster eyes beyond the satisfaction of a bodily need after dinner and the expectation of a bodily pleasure before the meal. Such were the people among whom he must distinguish himself. But what Julian did not know, what they refrained from telling him, was that to be at the top of the various classes of dogma, church history, etc., which were studied in the seminary, was nothing more in their eyes than a sin of vainglory, since Voltaire, since two-chamber government, which is at bottom only distrust and private judgment, and instills in the heart of the people that fatal habit of want of confidence. The Church of France seems to have realized that books are its true enemies. It is heartfelt submission that is everything in its eyes. Success in studies, even in sacred studies, is suspect, and with good reason." End quote. Fouquet comes to visit him at the seminary, and then there's a bit more along the same lines. Quote, "This visit would have made a profound impression upon our hero had not the very next day a remark addressed to him by that little seminarist from Verrières, who seemed such a boy, led him to make an important discovery. Ever since he had been in the seminary, Julian's conduct had been nothing but a succession of false steps. He laughed bitterly at himself. As a matter of fact, the important actions of his life were wisely ordered, but he paid no attention to details, and the clever people in his seminary look only at details. And so he passed already among his fellow students as a free thinker. He had been betrayed by any number of trifling actions. He realized that since his entering the seminary, not an hour had passed, especially during recreation, that had not borne some consequence for or against him, had not increased the number of his enemies, or won him the goodwill of some seminarist who was genuinely virtuous or a trifle less boorish than the rest. The damage to be repaired was immense, the task one of great difficulty, Thenceforward, Julian's attention was constantly on the alert. It was a case of portraying himself in an entirely new character. And skipping ahead a bit, so learning is really nothing here, he told himself with scorn. Progress in dogma and sacred history and the rest of it count only in appearance. All that is said on that topic is intended to make fools like myself fall into the trap. Alas, my sole merit consisted in my rapid progress, in my faculty for grasping all that nonsense. Can it be that in their hearts they esteem it at its true value, judge of it as I do? And I was fool enough to be proud of myself. Those first places in class which I always obtain have served only to give me bitter enemies. Chazelle, who knows far more than I, always puts into his compositions some piece of stupidity which sends him down to the 50th place. If he obtains the first, it is when he is not thinking. From the moment in which Julian's eyes were opened, the long exercises of ascetic piety, such as the rosary 5 times weekly, the hymns to the Sacred Heart, etc., which had seemed to him of such deadly dullness, became the most interesting actions of his life." End quote. So he figures out that there's a kind of status inversion at the seminary, that he thought he was doing well because he was a good student, but the real measurement was to be a not good student, or at least to not be too good of a student, because even that is just a kind of vanity. Again, I disagree with that. I think it's good to be a good student, but this subculture is interesting, and the sincerity with which they're trying to follow their own principles. I think that's true that if not a believing Christian, then at least certainly the priests should have this level of humility and vigilance against any attachment of the ego to worldly life. And all of this is another example of the hypocrisy that runs throughout the book. And in a moment of despair, he's thinking about other courses he could take besides the seminary. He thinks of enlisting in the military, and then he says, quote, "He might become a teacher of Latin. He wanted so little to keep himself alive. But then, no career, no future for his imagination. It was a living death." End quote. And there, when Stendhal writes, he wanted so little to keep himself alive, he doesn't mean that he didn't want to be alive. He means that he needed so little. He didn't need much to keep himself alive. He could even be a teacher of Latin. And a Latin teacher doesn't make much money. But he says, no future for his imagination is a living death. And that's interesting to think of the extent to which our imagination is what keeps us going, that we're imagining some future, and that keeps us alive. Then we see another way that Julian offends the other seminary students. Quote, "It was about this time that Julian thought he might derive some benefit from his admiration of Monsieur de Maistre's book on the Pope. He did, as a matter of fact, astonish his fellow students. But this was a fresh misfortune. He annoyed them by expressing their opinions better than they could themselves. Monsieur Chélan had been a rash counselor for Julian, as he had been for himself. After training him to the habit of reasoning accurately and not letting himself be taken in by vain words, he had omitted to tell him that in a person of little repute this habit is a crime, for sound reasoning always gives offense. Julian's fine speech was therefore another crime against him. His companions, being compelled to think about him, succeeded in finding 2 words to express all the horror with which he filled them. They nicknamed him Martin Luther, chiefly, they said, because of that infernal logic of which he is so proud." End quote. So it's all good to be reasonable and have sound logic, but if you're not somebody of reputation, you should be careful because you might just annoy people. And maybe that's fine, but you should at least be aware that that's likely to happen. He goes to visit another priest who says, quote, "So you were afraid of those young rascals at the seminary. It is too kind of you to give them a thought," said the Abbé Chas. "Is a road any the worse because there are thorns in the hedges on either side of it? The traveler goes his way and leaves the wicked thorns to wither where they are. However, we must to work, my dear friend, to work." End quote. That's good advice from the priest. Every road has thorns on either side of it. You can just keep going and leave the thorns to wither where they are. There's another interesting description of religion as a means of political control. Quote, "The sober note of the bell ought to have suggested to Julian only the thought of the work of a score of men earning 50 centimes, and assisted perhaps by 15 or 20 of the faithful. He ought to have thought of the wear and tear of the ropes, of the timber, of the danger from the bell itself, which fell every 200 years, and to have planned some way of diminishing the wage of the ringers, or of paying them with some indulgence or other favor drawn from the spiritual treasury of the church, with no strain upon her purse. In place of these sage reflections, Julian's soul, excited by these rich and virile sounds, was straying through imaginary space. Never will he make either a good priest or a great administrator. Souls that are moved thus are capable at most of producing an artist. Here, Julian's presumption breaks out in the full light of day. 50, perhaps, of his fellow seminarists, made attentive to the realities of life by the public hatred and Jacobinism which, they are told, is lurking behind every hedge, on hearing the big bell of the cathedral, would have thought only of the wages paid to the ringers. They would have applied the genius of a barème to determine the question whether the degree of emotion aroused in the public was worth the money given to the ringers." End quote. So they're all hearing this bell ring, and Julian's imagination goes flying listening to the sound and the feeling that it gives him. And Stendhal is commenting that a proper priest or administrator would be thinking about the logistics of the bell, how to avoid paying the ringers for it, what to do about the ropes, how to keep it from falling, and most of all, the degree of emotion that the bell arouses in the public, and whether this merits its cost. So this is a vision of religion as a tool of social control. One of the priests advises him, quote, "Your career will be difficult. I see in you something that offends the common herd. Jealousy and calumny will pursue you. In whatever place Providence may set you, your companions will never set eyes on you without hating you, and if they pretend to love you, it will be in order to betray you the most surely. For this there is but one remedy. Have recourse only to God, who has given you, to punish you for your presumption, this necessity of being hated. Let your conduct be pure. That is the sole resource that I can see for you. If you hold fast to the truth with an invincible embrace, sooner or later your enemies will be put to confusion." End quote. That's good advice for anybody. He gets a promotion, and he's made a kind of lecturer. Quote, "Julian noticed that they hated him less. He had been expecting, on the contrary, an intensification of their hatred. That secret desire that no one should speak to him, which was all too apparent and had made him so many enemies, was no longer a sign of absurd pride. In the eyes of the coarse beings among whom he lived, it was a proper sense of his own dignity. Their hatred diminished perceptibly, especially among the youngest of his companions, now become his pupils, whom he treated with great courtesy. In course of time, he had even supporters. It became bad form to call him Martin Luther. But why speak of his friends, his enemies? It is all so ugly, and all the more ugly, the more accurately it is drawn from life. These are, however, the only teachers of ethics that the people have, and without them, where should we be? Will the newspaper ever manage to take the place of the parish priest?" End quote. A few times in the novel, Stendhal speaks kind of in his own voice. I've seen this called authorial intrusion, though maybe there's another term for it. And he does that here. He's talking about Julian, and suddenly he says, "It's all so ugly, and all the more ugly, the more accurately it is drawn from life." I enjoyed that in the book in general. It really makes it feel like Stendhal is telling you a story about these people that he knows. To have the narrator be a bit more visible is kind of interesting. Though I could also imagine that this would get annoying if it was overused. But the most interesting thought there was that for the people, for the public, for ordinary people, if you don't go out of your way to try to develop yourself, then the only teachers of ethics that those people have are their friends and their enemies. That by itself is interesting. And then he asks, will the newspaper ever manage to take the place of the parish priest? And I don't know if newspapers have succeeded in doing that, but they certainly today, 200 years after Stendhal was writing this, claim to be able to do that. I think far more people turn to the newspaper for what they ought to do and ought not to do than turn to a priest. Newspapers, for better or for worse, and I would say for much worse, have become a moral reference for ordinary people. And it's very interesting that Stendhal was speculating about that so long ago. Julian is visiting with his friend Fouquet again. Quote, before midnight, Julian was with Fouquet, whose sober mind was more astonished than delighted by the future which seemed to be in store for his friend. The end of it will be, said this liberal elector, a post under government, which will oblige you to take some action that will be pilloried in the newspapers. It will be through your disgrace that I shall have news of you. Remember that, even financially speaking, it is better to earn 100 louis in an honest trade in timber, where you are your own master, than to receive 4,000 francs from a government worth that of King Solomon himself. End quote. So Fouquet says it's better to earn your own money honestly, even if it's a lot less than to work for the government at all, first of all, but certainly to do anything dishonest. Fouquet, though he is a very minor character in the story, is far more principled than Julian is. Commenting on the censorship and self-censorship that existed at the time, Stendhal writes, quote, "So long as you did not speak lightly of God, or of the clergy, or of the king, or of the men in power, or of the artists patronized by the court, or of anything established, so long as you did not say anything good of Berenger, or of the opposition press, or of Voltaire, or of Rousseau, or of anything that allowed itself the liberty of a little freedom of speech, so long, above all, as you did not talk politics, you could discuss anything you pleased with freedom." End quote. Julian gradually makes his way into the home of the second woman with whom he has a romantic affair, though she's not married yet. That's Matilda. And these people are all very wealthy in Paris, and they're, as I mentioned, the descendants of crusaders, and they're very proud of this heritage. Quote, "These noble personages did not conceal their sincere contempt for everyone that was not the offspring of people who rode in the king's carriages. Julian observed that the word crusade was the only one that brought to their faces an expression of intense seriousness, blended with respect. Their ordinary respect had always a shade of condescension." End quote. And here's an interesting thought about money. Quote, "And so, thought Julian, as he heard the sound of their laughter on the staircase, I have been allowed to see the opposite extreme to my own position. I have not an income of 20 louis, and I have found myself rubbing shoulders with a man who has an income of 20 louis an hour, and they laughed at him. A sight like that cures one of envy." End quote. So when you think about how some people have more money than you could ever imagine, and some other people still make fun of them, it makes you say, well, then I'm just going to forget the whole thing. Not because you necessarily couldn't, so why bother, but it makes it seem so vapid. It's a very interesting example that Stendhal gives there. And by the way, there Julian says a sight like that cures one of envy, but it doesn't. He keeps going. He's still envious. He still wants status. He still wants the money. He wants the title. He wants the office, the fame. He wants all of it. So he says that, but he wasn't cured of anything. And by the way, a topic that came up earlier, I think, or maybe I just thought of it and didn't mention it, is this question of to what extent is a person a product of their environment, of the time that they lived in, of their class, of their situation. And that comes up in this story, and some people have interpreted this novel as being about the position that poverty or simply being born in a village, being a peasant, the position that that puts a person in. And that's valid and has to be considered, but Julian is an unusual case. He had exit ramps. Fouquet offers him a job. Elisa wants to marry him. He gets these clues like this where he can see that it's a little bit vapid. They shut up the prisoner who's singing a song in the next room. The seminary seems hypocritical. And yet none of this discourages him. He keeps going. He wants it. Doesn't matter if it's all fake. Doesn't matter if it's bad. He wants it. So poverty alone, I don't even want to say poverty, a peasant life, being born to a peasant family alone does not get you to be Julian Sorel. He's something a bit more than that. Later, when he is ruminating about class, Julian thinks, quote, "That is the immense advantage which they have over us," he said to himself, when alone in the garden. "The history of their ancestors raises them above vulgar sentiments, and they have not always to be thinking of their daily bread. What a wretched state of things," he added bitterly. "I'm not worthy to discuss these serious matters. My life is nothing more than a sequence of hypocrisies, because I have not an income of 1,000 francs with which to buy my bread." End quote. And not only does this also touch on the hypocrisy that runs throughout the book, listeners of this podcast will know that in Rameau's Nephew, Denis Diderot talks explicitly about this specific type of hypocrisy, the hypocrisy that's necessary to earn one's living, or is for most people. At one point, Julian is talking about different kinds of bravery. Quote, "That girl is making a fool of me," Julian would think. "She's plotting with her brother to mystify me. But she seems so to despise her brother's want of energy. He's brave, and there is no more to be said, she tells me. And even then, brave in facing the swords of the Spaniards. In Paris, everything alarms him. He sees everywhere the danger of ridicule. He has not an idea which ventures to depart from the fashion. It is always I who am obliged to take up her defense, a girl of 19. At that age, can a girl be faithful at every moment of the day to the code of hypocrisy that she has laid down for herself?" End quote. And later, Matilda is fretting about how bored she is with the men around her. Quote, "To have been in a real battle, one of Napoleon's battles in which 10,000 soldiers were killed, is a proof of courage. Exposing oneself to danger elevates the soul and saves it from the boredom in which all my poor adorers seem to be plunged, and it is contagious, that boredom. Which of them ever dreams of doing anything out of the common? They seek to win my hand, a fine enterprise. I'm rich, and my father will help on his son-in-law. Oh, if only he could find one who was at all amusing." End quote. And we haven't talked about this as much yet. Matilda is chronically bored, and she wants some excitement. She wants somebody to entertain her, to be out of the ordinary, to be adventurous. And Julian gives her that, but on the other hand, he's low class. Sometimes she likes that even more, but other times she has to kind of work herself up to accepting it. Quote, "What is it that he lacks? A name and a fortune. He would make a name for himself. He would acquire a fortune. The Marquis de Croisenois lacks nothing, and all his life long he will be merely a duke, half ultra, half liberal, an undecided creature speaking when action is required, always holding back from extremes, and consequently finding himself everywhere in the second rank. Where is the great action which is not an extreme at the moment in which one undertakes it? It is when it is accomplished that it seems possible to creatures of common clay." End quote. Similarly, she says, quote, "Is it my fault if the young men at the court are such ardent devotees of the conventions and turn pale at the mere thought of any adventure that is slightly out of the common? A little expedition to Greece or Africa is to them the height of audacity, and even then they can only go in a troop. As soon as they find themselves alone, they become afraid, not of Bedouin spears, but of ridicule, and that drives them mad. My little Julian, on the contrary, will only act alone. Never, in that privileged being, is there the slightest thought of seeking the approval and support of others. He despises other people. That is why I do not despise him." End quote. Here we see that he's in his early 20s and she's in her late teens. She really likes that he's too cool for everybody. He despises everyone. I'm having trouble putting my finger on why that seems to me to be a clear mark of immaturity, but that's how it seems to me. Here's another interesting observation from Stendhal. Quote, "This love was founded only upon Matilda's rare beauty, or rather upon her regal manner and her admirable style and dress. In this respect, Julian was still an upstart. A beautiful woman of fashion is, we are assured, the sight that most astonishes a clever man of peasant origin when he arrives amid the higher ranks of society." End quote. Another sentence that shows Julian's youthful arrogance is, quote, "It must be admitted the glare in Julian's eyes was ghastly, his expression hideous. It was eloquent of unmitigated crime. He was an unhappy man, at war with the whole of society." End quote. That sounds to me like a young guy who hasn't quite found his footing yet and just needs to cool off. What's strange about Julian is that there isn't an obvious motivation for all of this bad energy he has. If your actions or position could be described as being at war with the whole of society, then that shows that you don't know either what it is you're struggling for or what you're struggling against. You're simply struggling against everything, which again looks to me like immaturity. And Julian's in his early 20s. Some guys have maybe figured out more by that age, but some guys haven't. And maybe in a few more years, he would have figured some of this out. Here's another passage of why Matilda prefers Julian to the other men that are around her. And I could have pulled these quotes together and read them back to back, but I was just reading them in the order of my notes, in the order that they appear in the book. Quote, "She abhorred want of character. It was her sole objection to the handsome young men among whom she lived. The more gracefully they mocked at everything which departed from the fashion, or which followed it wrongly when intending to follow it, the more they condemned themselves in her eyes. They were brave, and that was all. And besides, how are they brave, she asked herself, in a duel? But the duel is nothing more than a formality. Everything is known beforehand, even what a man is to say when he falls. Skipping ahead a little, a man will face danger at the head of a squadron all glittering with steel, but a danger that is solitary, strange, sudden, truly ugly. Alas, said Matilda, it was at the court of Henri that one found men great by character as well as by birth. If Julian had served at Jarnac or at Moncontour, I should no longer be in doubt. In those days of strength and prowess, Frenchmen were not mere dolls. The day of battle was almost the day of least perplexity. Yes, she went on. There was more true courage in crossing the town alone at 11 o'clock at night, after leaving the Hôtel de Soissons, occupied by Catherine de Medici, than there is today in dashing to Algiers. A man's life was a succession of hazards. Nowadays, civilization has banished hazard. There is no room for the unexpected. If it appears in our ideas, there are not epigrams enough to cope with it. If it appears in events, no act of cowardice is too great for our fear. Whatever folly our fear makes us commit is excused us. degenerate and boring age, end quote. This next passage, I'll read it first and then we can talk about it. And this is talking about Matilda. Quote, Mademoiselle de la Mole appeared behind her closed window. He half showed her his letter. She bowed her head. At once, Julien ran up to his own room and happened to meet on the main staircase the fair Matilda, who snatched the letter with perfect composure and laughing eyes. What passion there was in the eyes of that poor Madame de Renal, Julien said to himself, when even after 6 months of intimate relations she ventured to receive a letter from me. Never once, I am sure, did she look at me with a laugh in her eyes, end quote. And I'm not sure if it's because of the passage itself. I don't think it'll have the same effect just hearing that passage as it did when I read it, because this is amid Julien and Matilda sneaking around and giving each other letters and meeting secretly. But for some reason, when I read this passage the first time, I could imagine it very vividly. You go to this beautiful woman's house at night and you're bringing her a letter and you show it to her and she's excited to get it from you, so she meets you on the stairs and snatches it from you and looks at you with laughing eyes. For some reason, when I read that, I could very vividly imagine that moment and feel that all throughout the 19th century and further back into the past, there were all these moments like that, these ineffable moments between people. And the people who experienced them are now long dead. But those moments are somehow still hidden there in the past. Even if no one can now remember them, they happened. One of the fun things about reading, in this case fiction, is you never quite know what sentence is going to activate something, to throw open a door in your imagination. In this next passage, I like Stendhal's comment about genius, but it is sort of funny that Matilda is thinking this to herself about herself. This shows the vanity of Julien and Matilda. Quote, an ordinary girl, she said to herself, would have sought for the man of her choice among the young fellows who attract every eye in a drawing room. But one of the characteristics of genius is not to let its thoughts move in the rut traced by the common herd. End quote. Here's another funny example of Stendhal's authorial intrusion. The scene in this case doesn't really matter, so I'll just get into it. Quote, Monsieur has the floor, he said, indicating the personage with the fatherly air, who was wearing 3 or 4 waistcoats. Julien felt that it would have been more natural to call him the gentleman with the waistcoats. He supplied himself with paper and wrote copiously. Here, the author would have liked to insert a page of dots. That will not look pretty, says the publisher, and for so frivolous a work, not to look pretty means death. Politics, the author resumes, are a stone attached to the neck of literature, which, in less than 6 months, drowns it. Politics in the middle of imaginative interests are like a pistol shot in the middle of a concert. The noise is deafening without being emphatic. It is not in harmony with the sound of any of the instruments. This mention of politics is going to give deadly offense to half my readers, and to bore the other half, who have already found far more interesting and emphatic politics in their morning paper. If your characters do not talk politics, the publisher retorts, they are no longer Frenchmen of 1830, and your book ceases to hold a mirror, as you claim. End quote. So Stendhal inserts this argument that he has with his publisher right in the middle of his book. He says, I wanted to put a whole page of dots here, but my publisher wouldn't let me. And then I guess the publisher must have said you should put something political in there. And he says, politics in a work of the imagination are like a pistol shot at a concert. And the publisher says, no, you gotta. Otherwise, you're not showing 1830 accurately. I imagine that then Stendhal said, fine, but I'm putting all this in there too. And the publisher said, fine, do whatever you want, I don't care. There were a few more passages that I had noted down to read, but those give away the ending a little bit, so I'm going to skip them. This novel was difficult to pin down. I don't know quite how Stendhal wanted us to think of Julien and Matilda. On the one hand, he might have been thinking of it as a cautionary tale. Don't do what Julien did. And Matilda is kind of an airhead. On the other hand, he might have been using these two young characters for the kind of social rebellion that's only possible when you're young and you don't yet have any investment in an existing system, so you can criticize it relatively easily, though you also don't have any experience in that system. He might have been using the voices of these young characters to put out legitimate criticism that he felt of society at that time. I think it was a combination of those two things. And while this kind of fiction is not the thing that I gravitate toward most readily, I think this is very valuable because it shows us a little bit about how life used to be. I've talked about this before, about the use of fiction as a historical source. And of course, you have to be very careful because fiction is not history. Of course, it's not. But in reading books like The Red and the Black, and virtually any novel written in the 19th century or earlier, you get something that can be hard to see from a history book, which is what was day-to-day life like? I think we talked about this in looking at Turgenev. There are history books maybe that talk a little bit about society, French society in the 19th century, but Stendhal was there. And while he was writing this book, he wasn't recounting the details of a specific meeting or encounter with a specific woman factually, like a history of it, but he was drawing on what he experienced. And so from this kind of book, we can get a view of a time period that is likely very accurate and very realistic, especially when you're dealing with realist authors, and that would be hard to get from other sources. And the story is valuable, and the morality is valuable, and everything that we've talked about is valuable. But so is this that I'm saying now. This use of fiction from history to access, to see what life was like in the past, and maybe to compare. On the one hand, to see what perhaps we don't need to emulate, but also to see what maybe was better in the past, what has been lost, and what we might choose to revive and apply to our lives today. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope that you, the person listening to this, I'm speaking to you, will go to my website and consider buying yourself a book. If you've already read Frankenstein, you can buy it for a friend, a family member. It makes an excellent gift. I've prepared a very nice edition with original cover art and 97 footnotes that define some of the more unusual vocabulary words that Mary Shelley uses. Unlike The Red and the Black, Frankenstein is an excellent entrance into classic literature. It's very short, it's very action-packed, so I hope you'll go and get yourself a copy right now. And of course, thank you very much for listening. I put a lot of work into making these podcasts. I have a full-time job and I'm married, but it's satisfying to know that some people who I think love books and reading as much as I do are getting something out of listening to these, so I'm happy to put in the work. Farewell, until next time, take care, and happy reading.